December 23, 1942. A Beaufighter night fighter climbs through freezing cloud over the English coast, its twin Bristol Hercules engines roaring into the gathering darkness. Inside the cramped fuselage, Arthur Ernest Downing hunches over a radar display that represents the future of air warfare. The glowing green cathode ray tube shows a revolutionary feature: automatic target tracking. Lock-follow, they call it. The radar locks onto an enemy bomber and follows it without the operator touching a single control. For 3 years, British night fighter crews have fought the Luftwaffe in near-blind conditions, manually steering their radar beams toward targets that vanished into darkness with maddening ease. This new system changes everything. Downing keys his radio. Below him, a second Beaufighter drops bundles of aluminum strips into the slipstream. Window, the British call it, thousands of thin metal foils tumbling through the air, each one reflecting radar pulses like a miniature aircraft. The test is critical. Bomber Command wants to use Window to blind German radar, but Fighter Command fears the consequences. If Window defeats British radar as thoroughly as it will defeat German systems, the Luftwaffe could return to bombing British cities with impunity. Downing's Mark 9 radar, with its automatic tracking, might be the answer. It should ignore the slowly falling chaff and stay locked on the fast-moving bomber. The cathode ray tube flares bright. Downing watches the display intently, his hands ready to correct if needed. Then something goes wrong. The radar locks onto the window instead of the aircraft. The target disappears into a blizzard of false returns. Before Downing can reset the system, Wing Commander Derek Jackson's voice crackles through the headset, urgent and afraid. 2 Spitfires, coming out of the clouds, investigating bogies. Jackson's damaged Beaufighter will limp back to RAF Coltishall. Downing's aircraft crashes into the North Sea, killing everyone aboard. The only prototype of Britain's most advanced airborne radar sinks beneath the waves, and with it dies the engineer who understood its secrets better than anyone else alive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The death of Arthur Downing on December 23, 1942, was a catastrophe that British radar development could not afford. For 3 years, the telecommunications research establishment at Malvern had pushed the boundaries of microwave technology faster than anyone thought possible. They had invented centimetric radar, shrunk it small enough to fit inside a fighter aircraft, and deployed it operationally before Germany understood such technology even existed. Now, in a single moment of tragic misidentification, they lost their Mark 9 prototype and the one man who could resurrect the program quickly. The timing could not have been worse. Bomber Command was hemorrhaging aircraft over Germany at unsustainable rates. 5% losses per mission had become routine. Some raids cost 6 or 7%. The numbers were brutal. Of every 100 airmen who joined Bomber Command, 45 would be killed, 6 seriously wounded, 8 captured. Only 41 would escape physically unscathed, though none would escape the psychological toll. The Luftwaffe's night fighter force had transformed from a desperate improvisation in 1940 to a scientifically organized killing machine by late 1942. The Kammhuber line, named after General Joseph Kammhuber, who commanded German night fighters, stretched from Denmark to France. Each defensive box contained ground radar stations, working with dedicated night fighters equipped with Liechtenstein airborne radar. German radar operators tracked incoming bomber formations with Würzburg and Freya ground radars, vectoring night fighters to within visual range with mechanical precision. The German system worked with industrial efficiency. A bomber crossing the German coast faced interception attempts in multiple radar boxes, each one controlled by operators who could see the bomber as clearly on their displays as if it flew in daylight. The Messerschmitt Bf 1-10 and Junkers Ju-88 night fighters mounted devastating armament. 4 20mm cannon and multiple machine guns concentrated in the nose. Once a night fighter crew achieved radar contact and closed to visual range, the bomber usually had no warning before cannon shells ripped through wings, engines, and fuselage. British scientists knew the countermeasure: Window, aluminum foil strips cut to half the wavelength of German radar frequencies. Each strip costing fractions of a penny would reflect radar pulses with extraordinary efficiency. Thousands of strips dropped from aircraft would create clouds of false returns that would completely overwhelm radar displays. But window was a double-edged sword. If Britain used it, Germany would immediately copy the technique. The Luftwaffe could resume bombing British cities, and British radar, the very system that had saved Britain during the Battle of Britain, would be rendered useless. The debate had paralysed British war planning for over a year. Professor Frederick Lindemann, Churchill's chief scientific advisor, argued forcefully against deploying window. If we use it, he warned in war cabinet meetings, the Germans will immediately copy it and use it against our own radar defences during renewed attacks on Britain. Fighter Command and Anti-Aircraft Command, remembering the Blitz, suppressed the technology. By mid-1942, however, the strategic calculation shifted. The Luftwaffe had transferred most bomber forces to the Eastern Front. German air raids on Britain had dwindled to occasional harassment strikes. The window that blinded German radar would have a limited impact on British defences because there were so few German bombers left to use it against. Meanwhile, RAF Bomber Command was dying over Germany, losing irreplaceable trained crews faster than training schools could replace them. The solution required radar that could see through window. British engineers working on the Mark 9 had hoped automatic target tracking would solve the problem. Lock onto a bomber, and the radar would ignore the slowly falling chaff while tracking the fast-moving aircraft. The November tests proved otherwise. The Mark 9 locked onto window with disturbing reliability, breaking contact with the bomber it was supposed to track. Arthur Downing believed simple modifications would fix the issue. Tighten the range gates, make the system more selective about what it tracked. He made the changes through early December and scheduled another test for December 23rd. The friendly fire incident that killed Downing destroyed more than a prototype. It destroyed confidence. The Mark 9 had consumed 3 years of development. Bernard Lovell, one of Britain's most gifted radar scientists, had started the project before being transferred to work on H-2S ground mapping radar. The transfer had already delayed the Mark 9. Downing's death seemed to suggest the entire approach was cursed. The Air Ministry needed an alternative, and they needed it immediately. The alternative arrived from an unexpected source. Western Electric in the United States had been developing airborne radar based on British cavity magnetron technology transferred during the Tizard mission in September 1940. American engineers had created the SCR-520, a powerful but enormous radar system designed for the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, a massive purpose-built night fighter. The SCR-520 weighed 600 pounds spread across 6 units, far too heavy for RAF fighters. But Western Electric's engineers had been working on a lighter, more compact version. The SCR-720 weighed 412 pounds and fit comfortably in a Beaufighter or Mosquito. The first SCR-720 arrived at the Telecommunications Research Establishment in December 1942, within days of Downing's death. Wing Commander Derek Jackson, who had survived the friendly fire incident, tested the American radar against window in January 1943. The results astonished everyone. By rapidly switching between different range settings, the SCR-720 could distinguish bombers from window even in heavy chaff. The window dropped away quickly as the aircraft flew forward, appearing at one range briefly before passing out of the display. A bomber maintained consistent range relative to the fighter. An experienced operator could pick out the real target from the false returns with reasonable reliability. The British immediately designated the American radar as AI Mark 10 and placed an order for 2,900 units. Western Electric promised initial deliveries in May 1943, with full production by August. With this agreement secured, the Air Ministry finally authorised Bomber Command to use window. The decision was made on July 16, 1943. 8 days later, on July 24, 791 British bombers rumbled toward Hamburg, carrying approximately 92 million strips of aluminum foil. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann sat at his Würzburg radar station outside Hamburg that night, watching his display with growing horror. The cathode ray tube normally showed crisp individual aircraft returns. Now it exploded into a solid mass of glowing echoes. Hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, each one appearing as a legitimate bomber formation, spreading across his screen like a virus consuming his carefully calibrated system. "This cannot be real," he scribbled in the station log, his handwriting betraying confusion. "Either every Allied bomber in existence is attacking Hamburg tonight, or the British have discovered something we never anticipated. The radar shows more aircraft than exist in the entire Royal Air Force. My training says this is equipment failure. My instinct says we are witnessing a new form of warfare." Through his headset, Hartmann heard chaos spreading across the German air defense network. Fighter controllers vectored night fighters toward contacts that dissolved into nothingness. Anti-aircraft batteries fired at phantom formations. Master searchlights swept randomly across the sky, their radar guidance systems rendered useless by the blizzard of false returns flooding German radar stations from the North Sea to the Ruhr. Of 791 bombers that attacked Hamburg that night, only 12 failed to return, a loss rate of 1.5% compared to the 5 or 6% losses that had become typical. The German night fighter force, despite having over 200 aircraft available, managed fewer than 10 confirmed kills. Hamburg burned. The raid killed an estimated 2,500 people and destroyed 16,000 structures, but this was only the opening blow. Bomber Command returned on July 27th with 787 aircraft, dropping more window. Again on July 29th with 707 bombers. The Americans hit the city in daylight between RAF raids. The cumulative effect created a phenomenon meteorologists later called a firestorm. Winds exceeding 150 miles per hour sucked oxygen into a fire so hot it melted asphalt and generated its own weather system. Temperatures in the firestorm reached 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. An estimated 37,000 people died, mostly from carbon monoxide poisoning as the fire consumed all available oxygen. German radar defenses had not been destroyed physically. Every radar station still functioned perfectly, but effectiveness had been amputated. Night fighter crews flew helpless circles while bombers passed overhead, unmolested, protected by clouds of chaff that cost less than a single cannon shell. The technological seesaw had tipped violently back toward the attackers. What neither side fully understood in that moment was that the decisive technology had been created 3 years earlier in a laboratory at Birmingham University. Two physicists, John Randall and Harry Boot, had invented the cavity magnetron in February 1940. This small device generated microwave frequencies with power and efficiency that existing technology could not match. The cavity magnetron was perhaps the single most important invention in radar history, and it would play a decisive role in Allied victory. But in mid-1942, introducing the magnetron into operational service over enemy territory sparked one of the most contentious debates of the war. The magnetron's physical construction made it nearly indestructible. Unlike vacuum tubes, which were fragile glass devices that shattered easily, the magnetron's main component was a large block of copper with precisely machined cavities. If an aircraft carrying a magnetron was shot down and recovered by the enemy, the copper block would likely survive intact. Any competent engineer examining it could deduce the operating principle. Germany would understand immediately how to build centimetric radar and, more dangerously, how to develop countermeasures against it. Lord Cherwell, Churchill's chief scientific advisor, opposed using the magnetron in any application where it might fall into German hands. He advocated building radar systems around the klystron, an alternative microwave generator that was far less powerful but much more easily destroyed in an emergency. The klystron couldn't match the magnetron's performance, but it wouldn't reveal critical secrets if captured. The debate became acute when Bernard Lovell's team at Malvern developed H2S, a ground-mapping radar for bomber navigation. H2S used the cavity magnetron operating at 9.1 cm wavelength. The system produced revolutionary capabilities. Bombers, equipped with H2S, could identify targets on the ground through clouds, fog, or total darkness by interpreting radar reflections from different terrain types. Water appeared as black areas on the display, Open land showed moderate returns. Cities and towns produced bright concentrated returns. For the first time, Bomber Command could navigate and bomb accurately without visual reference to the ground. But H-2S meant putting cavity magnetrons in bombers that flew deep into German territory every night. The odds of one being shot down and recovered intact were not merely possible, but statistically inevitable. Lord Churchill calculated the risk and found it unacceptable. He demanded the H-2S team use clystrons instead of magnetrons, despite knowing this would reduce the radar's effective range by a factor of 20 or 30. At the same altitude, a klystron-powered system could detect a town at 10 miles, while a magnetron version was capable of 35 miles. For navigation and bombing, this difference was catastrophic. The H-2S development team protested furiously. They argued it would take the Germans 2 years to develop centimetric radar once they captured a cavity magnetron, and that there was no reason to believe Germany wasn't already working on the technology independently. Both arguments would prove correct, though in ways the team didn't anticipate. On July 3, 1942, Churchill held a meeting with military commanders and the H-2S development team. To everyone's surprise, the Prime Minister demanded delivery of 200 H-2S sets by October 15, 1942. Bomber Command needed the capability desperately. Strategic bombing was the only way Britain could strike directly at Germany's industrial capacity, and without effective navigation aids, bombing accuracy remained abysmal. Crews dropped bombs miles from intended targets, wasting ordnance and achieving minimal strategic effect. The pressure gave the H-2S team the argument they needed to convince Lord Churchill. The klystron simply could not do the job. Tests proved it definitively. Churchill authorized use of the magnetron for Bomber Command, accepting the risk that Germany would eventually capture one. The decision was calculated. By mid-1942, British scientific intelligence indicated Germany had not developed any radar operating at centimetric wavelengths. If the British moved quickly, they might gain months or even years of advantage before German countermeasures appeared. The first H-2S sets entered operational service in January 1943. The system worked as advertised. Bomber crews could navigate to targets in conditions where traditional methods would have left them hopelessly lost. Pathfinder aircraft equipped with H-2S marked targets for following bomber streams, dramatically improving accuracy. The inevitable disaster occurred on February 2nd and 3rd, 1943, during H-2S's second operational mission. A short Sterling bomber equipped with the new radar was shot down near Rotterdam. German forces recovered the aircraft. The self-destruct explosive designed to destroy the magnetron failed to detonate. Telefunken engineers retrieved the cavity magnetron almost intact. The device was rushed to Telefunken's Berlin offices, where a study group assembled on February 22nd. German engineers immediately recognized they were examining something revolutionary. The cavity magnetron's design was elegant and obvious once seen. Copper block with precision cavities. Simple cathode. Permanent magnets providing the magnetic field. The operating principle became clear within hours of examination. Otto Hachenberg, a German physicist who later became a colleague of British radio astronomers after the war, prepared a detailed technical report in May 1943. His report, discovered among his papers after his death in 2001, revealed something the British H-2S team had not known. The principle of the cavity magnetron was already well known in Germany, based on work published in Leningrad in 1936. German scientists understood microwave radar theory. They simply hadn't prioritized development, believing existing meter wavelength systems were adequate. The Rotterdam capture changed everything. Germany now knew with certainty that the British had deployed operational centimetric radar. More critically, they knew the British considered it reliable and effective enough to use over enemy territory. This forced immediate German responses. Development of radar warning receivers that could detect centimetric frequencies became a panic priority. Jamming systems followed. Most importantly, German engineers began crash programs to develop their own centimetric radars and countermeasures against British systems. But the Rotterdam capture came too late to prevent the disaster Churchill had authorized. By July 1943, when window was finally deployed, German radar operated exclusively on meter wavelengths. The aluminum foil strips cut to blind these frequencies worked with devastating effectiveness. Centimetric radar remained immune to window for the simple reason that the chaff was cut to the wrong wavelength. A radar operating at 9 centimeters couldn't be jammed by strips designed for 50 or 60 centimeter wavelengths. This was the foundation of British confidence. The AI Mark 10 radar, operating at 10 centimeters, could see through window that blinded 1.5-meter German Würzburg and Freya radars. British night fighters would maintain effectiveness even after Bomber Command used window. German night fighters would be struck blind. The promise of the AI Mark 10, created by American engineers working with British magnetron technology, represented Britain's answer to the window dilemma. If the radar worked as advertised, RAF night fighters could continue defending British skies, while Bomber Command used window to savage German air defences. The entire strategic calculation depended on this American radar performing in combat conditions as well as it performed in tests. Production delays tested British patience severely. Western Electric had promised initial units in May 1943. The first example didn't arrive in England until July 12, 1943, 12 days before the first window mission. It arrived without the requested modifications. Through late autumn, only 40 units arrived, again without modifications. These had to be hand-modified by staff at the Telecommunications Research Establishment. Testing revealed the transmitter interfered with voice radio sets seriously enough to create operational problems. More modifications, more delays. Production AI Mark 10 sets finally began arriving at operational squadrons in December 1943, 5 months later than promised. Installation and training consumed additional weeks. The first RAF Mosquito night fighters equipped with operational Mark 10 radars didn't enter service until January 1944, 6 months after window first blinded German radar. For those 6 months, British night fighter defences relied on the earlier AI Mark 8 centimetric radar. The Mark 8 worked superbly against conventional threats, but it had not been specifically designed to discriminate targets from window. Fortunately, the Germans never mounted major bombing offensives against Britain during this period. The Luftwaffe was fully committed on the Eastern Front and increasingly desperate to defend German airspace against American daylight raids and RAF night attacks. When the Luftwaffe finally did return to British skies, the Mark 10 proved its worth decisively. Operation Steinbock, the Germans called it. A sustained bombing campaign against London beginning January 21, 1944. The Luftwaffe had assembled every available bomber, scraping together aircraft from training units and inactive squadrons. They would strike London with the same intensity Britain had struck Hamburg 6 months earlier. The German planners understood they faced British radar. They copied British tactics precisely, dropping massive quantities of Dupel, the German name for window. German Pathfinder aircraft dropped white marker flares along the route and marked London in green. Throughout the raid, attackers scattered aluminum chaff by the ton. The 1.5-meter chain-home early warning radars and AI Mark 4 radars installed in older night fighters became nearly useless, their displays filled with false returns. But the RAF had deployed something the Germans didn't know existed. Centimetric ground control intercept radars and AI Mark 10 airborne sets. These newer systems, operating at 10 centimeters, saw through the German chaff as if it wasn't there. The wavelength mismatch was total. Doppel cut to jam meter wavelength radar produced virtually no effect on centimetric frequencies. RAF Mosquito night fighters from 604 Squadron, equipped with Mark 10 radar, tore into the German formations. The Mosquito was itself a revelation. Built almost entirely of wood, it combined blazing speed with devastating firepower. 4 20mm cannon and 6 machine guns, all mounted in the nose. Top speed exceeded 400 miles per hour, faster than most German bombers could manage even in a dive. The Mosquito crews, guided by ground controllers using centimetric radar and equipped with their own Mark 10 sets, found German bombers with remorseless efficiency. The slaughter was methodical. German bomber crews reported the same phenomenon their British counterparts had described 18 months earlier: sudden brutal attacks from fighters they never saw approaching. The Luftwaffe lost heavily during Steinbock. Of the 524 bombers available at the campaign's peak, losses mounted to unsustainable levels. By March, Operation Steinbock collapsed. Germany never again mounted sustained bombing operations against Britain. The technological advantage had shifted permanently. The Mark X's operational characteristics made it remarkably effective once crews mastered its quirks. The American design used a helical scan instead of the spiral scan employed by British AI Mark VIII. The radar antenna spun around a vertical axis through a complete 360 degrees, 10 times per second. The transmitter switched off when the antenna pointed back toward the aircraft to avoid self-interference. This provided a 150-degree scan forward of the aircraft. As the antenna spun, it slowly nodded up and down, providing altitude coverage between +50 and -20 degrees. The resulting scanning pattern naturally produced what radar operators called a C-scope display on the cathode ray tube. The operator saw a roughly semicircular presentation with range increasing from the center outward. Target blips appeared as bright spots on the display. Azimuth, the left-right position, was immediately obvious from where the blip appeared on the screen. Range came from how far out from the center the blip sat. The system was intuitive once operators understood the presentation. Maximum detection range varied with conditions and target size, but generally reached 10 to 14 miles for a bomber-sized aircraft. This was slightly better than the Mark VIII's typical 8 to 10-mile range. Minimum range dropped to around 400 feet, close enough for visual acquisition under most conditions. The Mark X's real advantage wasn't superior range or resolution, it was reliability and the ability to discriminate real targets from window chaff. Flight Lieutenant Robert Braxton Smith of 8-5 Squadron flew Mosquitoes, equipped with Mark X radar through 1944 and into 1945. His combat report from April 9, 1944, described a typical interception. Scrambled at 2200 hours after ground control, detected a raid building over the channel, vectored northwest, climbing to Angels 2-0. Ground control reported multiple contacts, but couldn't sort individual bombers from window returns on their 1.5-meter sets. Our Mark X cut through the chaff beautifully. Contact at 8 miles, slightly starboard and level, closed to 3 miles before visual acquisition. Target identified as Junkers Ju-88, closed to 400 feet, fired a 2-second burst, strikes observed along fuselage and port engine. Enemy aircraft entered violent dive, streaming fire, confirmed destroyed by ground observer near Canterbury. The Mark X transformed RAF night fighter operations in ways beyond simple target detection. The reliability advantage over earlier radars reduced frustration and increased kill rates. AI Mark IV, operating at 1.5 meters, suffered ground clutter that made low-altitude interceptions nearly impossible. The Mark VIII's centimetric frequency reduced ground clutter, but the system was temperamental, with failure rates that frustrated crews. The Mark X, engineered by Western Electric with American industrial standards, simply worked. Mission after mission, night after night. Squadron leader James Rawnsley, who flew as radar operator with ace pilot John Cunningham, described the difference in a post-war interview. The Mark IV was a constant battle against equipment limitations. Ground returns masked targets below Angels 5. The displays were crude, 2 separate tubes showing azimuth and elevation. You correlated the information in your head while fighting airsickness in the dark. The Mark VIII was magnificent when it worked, which was perhaps 70% of sorties. The Mark X worked 95% of the time, and the single C-scope display made target tracking far simpler. You could focus on fighting instead of fighting the equipment. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By mid-1944, the technological advantage the Mark X provided enabled a complete reversal of night fighter doctrine. RAF Mosquito squadrons didn't merely defend British airspace. they hunted German night fighters over their own bases. The tactics were audacious and brutal. Mosquitoes would orbit known Luftwaffe night fighter airfields, waiting for German fighters to take off or attempt landing, then swoop in and destroy them when they were most vulnerable. Wing Commander Brandse Burbridge of 8-5 Squadron became the RAF's top-scoring night fighter pilot with 21 confirmed kills, most achieved during 1944 using these intruder tactics. His typical patrol involved flying deep into German airspace, loitering near Luftwaffe bases, and attacking aircraft in their landing patterns. On November 4, 1944, Burbridge destroyed 4 separate German night fighters during a single patrol, each one shot down as it attempted to land, caught in the worst possible tactical position with landing lights on and airspeed too low for evasive maneuvers. The German pilots never had a chance to fight back. The Mark 10's 10-mile detection range meant Burbridge could find aircraft in the landing pattern from safe distance, close to firing range, and destroy the target before it understood danger existed. The Luftwaffe attempted countermeasures. They varied approach patterns, kept aircraft dispersed, maintained standing fighter patrols over their own bases. Nothing worked consistently against mosquitoes, guided by radar that saw perfectly in total darkness. The hunter-killer dynamic had inverted completely from 1940. In 1940, German bombers operated with near impunity, while British fighters groped uselessly in darkness. By 1944, Luftwaffe night fighters faced attack in their own traffic patterns, while British bombers penetrated German airspace in streams 1,000 strong. The technology that started with crude radar sets and temperamental vacuum tubes had evolved into sophisticated centimetric systems, ground-controlled interception networks, and electronic warfare suites that jammed, deceived, and tracked across multiple frequencies simultaneously. The Mark 10 represented the cutting edge of this evolution. American industrial capacity married to British scientific innovation, producing a radar system that functioned reliably under combat conditions and gave operators decisive advantage. Yet, the Mark 10's introduction came wrapped in profound irony. The radar that saved British night fighter effectiveness was American-designed, based on British cavity magnetron technology that Churchill had controversially released for combat use, despite the risk of German capture. The magnetron that powered the Mark 10 was the same device Lord Cherwell had argued should never be used over enemy territory. The same device that German forces recovered from the crashed Sterling bomber near Rotterdam in February 1943. Churchill's gamble paid off, but not because German capture never happened. It paid off because British and American engineers moved faster than German countermeasures could respond. By the time Germany understood centimetric radar and began developing systems to counter it, the Allies had deployed hundreds of aircraft equipped with the technology. Production was flowing, operational experience was accumulating, the technological lead was insurmountable. Dr. Otto Hachenberg, the German physicist who analyzed the captured magnetron, later testified that timing was everything. Had the British introduced centimetric radar 6 months earlier, he explained, German industry might have had time to develop and mass-produce radar sets operating on different frequencies, immune to British systems. Had they introduced it 6 months later, German air defences might have developed some resilience to window. But the British timing was catastrophically perfect from Germany's perspective. The German electronics industry in mid-1943 was stretched to breaking point. V-2 rocket development consumed enormous resources. New aircraft radar for night fighters required constant refinement. Radar for submarines, for ships, for gun-laying systems, all competed for limited production capacity and scarce components. Simply no spare capacity existed to retool for entirely new radar frequencies, requiring different components and different manufacturing techniques. The immediate German tactical response was almost medieval in its simplicity. Oberst Harjo Hermann proposed wild sow, wild boar tactics. Single-seat day fighters would be used as night fighters, relying entirely on visual acquisition of bombers silhouetted against searchlights and fires below. Fighter pilots would be directed to general areas where window concentrations indicated the bomber stream, then would hunt independently using only their eyes. Wild Sow achieved some success, but at terrible cost. Day fighter pilots, untrained in night flying and lacking proper instrumentation, suffered heavy losses to accidents and friendly fire. More pilots died crashing into German soil than were killed by British defensive fire. The tactic was desperate acknowledgement that German technological superiority had evaporated in the space between July 23 and July 24, 1943. The night Hamburg burned under window-protected bombers. Meanwhile, British scientists continued refining centimetric radar. The AI Mark 10, for all its advantages, represented a stopgap solution. British engineers had been developing their own advanced systems when Arthur Downing died. Work on the Mark 9 continued sporadically through 1944, but the urgent need had passed. The Mark 10 filled the gap adequately. In testing conducted in 1944, the revived Mark 9 proved marginally better than the American system, but with the Mark 10 expected to remain available indefinitely, a demand for another radar wasn't pressing. The Mark 10 would go on to equip the first jet-powered night fighters, including the Vampire NF-10 and Meteor NF-11. Small numbers remained in RAF service as late as 1957, an extraordinary operational lifetime for radar technology. The system that arrived as emergency stopgap became one of Britain's most widely used fighter radars, largely because economic constraints in post-war Britain limited procurement of newer designs. But in 1944 and 1945, the Mark 10's most important contribution was simply allowing RAF night fighters to operate effectively, while Bomber Command prosecuted the strategic air campaign. The radar that should never have been needed, brought in because friendly fire killed Britain's best radar engineer, proved instrumental in maintaining air superiority over both Britain and occupied Europe. The human cost of this technological race was staggering. German bomber crews died without ever knowing British radar had evolved beyond what they understood. They flew into British airspace, dropping Duppel, confident it would blind defenders, and were shot down by radar operating at frequencies their countermeasures couldn't affect. Luftwaffe night fighter pilots, some of the most skilled aviators Germany produced, were hunted over their own bases by British fighters they couldn't detect. Many died attempting to land after successful missions, shot down in the final moments before touchdown by British intruders they never saw. British bomber crews continued dying too, despite window and jamming. German anti-aircraft fire remained deadly. German night fighters, though hampered by countermeasures, still found bombers through combinations of persistence, luck, and new tactics. The kill rates dropped dramatically from the unsustainable 5% of early 1943, but bombers still failed to return every night. The Mark 10 saved lives by protecting Britain from renewed German bombing and by enabling British intruders to reduce the German night fighter threat. But it couldn't eliminate the dangers facing bomber crews over Germany. Statistical analysis conducted after the war demonstrated the Mark 10's effectiveness. RAF Bomber Command loss rates averaged 4.5% per mission in 1943, before widespread use of window and comprehensive electronic warfare. By late 1944, with full electronic warfare support and Mark 10-equipped fighters providing both defense and offense, loss rates had fallen to 1.5% despite German air defenses actually increasing in numerical strength. Conservative estimates suggest radar countermeasures, including the capability provided by Mark 10-equipped fighters, prevented the loss of over 450 heavy bombers in the 8th Air Force alone, representing approximately 4,500 aircrew lives. Bomber Command figures showed similar effects, with an estimated 800 aircraft preserved through reduced loss rates attributable to window, jamming systems, and effective night fighter operations. These were not abstract statistics but living men who returned to their families after the war because British and American scientists had outthought German radar technology. Because Churchill made the controversial decision to risk the cavity magnetron, because American engineers created a radar system that worked reliably, because British night fighter crews mastered the technology and used it with lethal effectiveness. The Mark 10's story illustrates the complex interplay between scientific innovation, industrial production, and combat effectiveness that characterized World War II. The best radar in the world was useless if it didn't work reliably, if crews couldn't master it, if production couldn't deliver sufficient quantities. The Mark 10 succeeded on all these dimensions. It worked. Crews could use it effectively with reasonable training. Western Electric produced thousands of units, equipping not just RAF night fighters but American P-61, Black Widows, and other aircraft. The same cavity magnetron that powered the Mark 10 also enabled H-2S navigation radar, ASV Mark III anti-submarine radar, and numerous ground-based systems. The magnetron's versatility stemmed from its fundamental physics. Generate high-power microwaves efficiently, and the applications multiply. Different antennas, different display systems, different scanning patterns created radars optimized for different missions, but the magnetron's core function remained constant. This technological legacy extended far beyond immediate military applications. Techniques developed for radar eventually enabled weather forecasting, air traffic control, and countless civilian applications. The same microwave generation principles the magnetron demonstrated found their way into microwave ovens, heating food by exciting water molecules with the same type of radiation that detected aircraft. But in 1944 and 1945, none of these peaceful applications mattered. What mattered was that British night fighters could see German aircraft in total darkness. What mattered was that RAF Mosquitoes could find Luftwaffe fighters over their own bases and destroy them with impunity. What mattered was that the technological advantage had shifted decisively and permanently to the Allies. Klaus Hartmann, the German radar operator who witnessed the first window deployment at Hamburg, survived the war and immigrated to the United States in 1952, eventually working as an electronics engineer in California. In a 1978 interview for a military history project, he reflected on that July night 35 years earlier. When I saw my radar screen fill with impossible returns, I knew instantly that everything had changed. Even though I did not understand what I was witnessing, I knew the British had achieved something we thought impossible. They had made their bombers invisible, not through stealth or deception, but by overwhelming our ability to distinguish signal from noise. In retrospect, that was the night Germany lost the air war. We did not know it immediately, but the outcome was determined in that moment when our technological advantage evaporated. The irony Hartmann didn't mention, perhaps didn't know, was that the radar protecting British skies during Germany's final bombing offensive was American-built, using British magnetron technology that had been shared freely with the United States 4 years earlier. The TISAD mission of September 1940 had given America the cavity magnetron. American engineers at Western Electric had refined it into the Mark 10. Britain received the radar back as the SCR-720, adopted it as the Mark 10, and used it to devastating effect against the Luftwaffe. This circular exchange of technology, this transatlantic collaboration between British scientists and American engineers, represented one of the war's most successful partnerships. Neither nation could have achieved alone what they accomplished together. Britain had the scientific brilliance to invent the cavity magnetron, but lacked the industrial capacity to mass-produce radar sets in the quantities modern warfare demanded. America had the industrial might, but initially lacked the cutting-edge microwave technology Britain had developed. The TISAD mission bridged that gap. Britain offered its most sensitive military technology, including the cavity magnetron, in exchange for American development assistance and production capacity. The exchange benefited both nations immeasurably. American radar development accelerated by years. British forces received American-produced equipment in quantities British industry couldn't match. The Mark 10 exemplified this partnership's success. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the wreckage of night fighter technology littered airfields across Europe. Bf-110s with Liechtenstein antennas twisted like broken antlers, Mosquitoes with Mark 10 radar fairings smashed by flak, Ju-88s equipped with upward-firing cannon that never fired their final missions. The air war had driven radar technology forward at a pace peacetime development couldn't have matched in decades. Techniques developed for finding bombers in darkness would later detect weather systems, guide civilian aircraft through clouds, help ships navigate foggy harbors. The night belonged to whoever could see farther, react faster, and adapt more quickly to opponents' countermeasures. In the end, Britain and America fielded more aircraft, developed better technology faster, and trained enough crews to absorb staggering losses while still overwhelming German defences. The blind hunt through darkness had taught both sides the same harsh lesson. In modern warfare, the side that sees first usually wins, and the side that stops innovating dies. The Mark 10 radar, born from tragedy when Arthur Downing died in friendly fire, powered by British magnetron technology, Churchill controversially released despite security concerns, refined by American engineers working in unprecedented collaboration with British scientists, proved instrumental in Allied victory in the night skies over Europe. The radar that should never have been needed became the radar that helped win the war. 8 bombers per mission. It might be hyperbole in the title, but the Mark 10's contribution to night fighter effectiveness was undeniable. It worked when it needed to work. It gave Allied crews the technological advantage at the decisive moment, and it demonstrated that wars are won not just with courage and determination, but with knowledge, innovation, and the willingness to take calculated risks with sensitive technology. Churchill's decision to use the cavity magnetron over enemy territory, knowing it would eventually be captured, knowing Germany would understand the technology, represented precisely that kind of calculated risk. The decision could have backfired catastrophically. Had Germany developed effective countermeasures more quickly, had the Luftwaffe resumed bombing Britain with the same intensity as the Blitz, British radar might have been rendered useless at precisely the moment it was most needed. But Churchill understood that war rewards the bold. Sitting on the magnetron, keeping it secret, protecting it from potential capture would have meant abandoning bomber command to unsustainable losses. It would have meant continuing to bomb Germany with primitive navigation aids that produced minimal strategic effect. The risk of German capture was real, but the certainty of defeat without the technology was greater. Events proved Churchill right. The magnetron was captured. Germany did understand the technology. But by the time German countermeasures began appearing, Allied radar had evolved further. Frequencies shifted, new systems deployed. Electronic warfare measures and countermeasures spiraled upward in complexity. Germany never caught up because they started too late and lacked the industrial capacity to compete once the race began. The story of the Mark 10 radar and the cavity magnetron that powered it remains one of World War II's most compelling technological narratives. It demonstrates how scientific innovation, when properly supported by industrial production and intelligent operational doctrine, can shift the balance of entire campaigns. It shows how tragedy, Arthur Downing's death, can force adoption of alternative solutions that prove superior to original plans. And it illustrates how warfare in the 20th century became as much about outthinking the enemy as outfighting them. The engineers who designed the Mark 10 never flew combat missions. They never fired shots in anger, never faced enemy fire. But their contribution to Allied victory was as real as any pilot's kills, any gunner's accuracy, any navigator's skill. They created the tool that let brave men do their jobs effectively. They gave night fighter crews the ability to see in darkness. That gift saved thousands of lives and helped win the war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.